There was a time, not so long ago in the quiet scale of history, when a small corner of the world began to stretch its thoughts far beyond its shores. A time when the lands of Europe, bordered by gentle seas and winding rivers, slowly turned their gaze outward, toward horizons that shimmered with mystery. Tonight, as you settle in and allow your mind to drift, imagine those early evenings along Europe's coast. The air is cool, touched by salt and the soft whisper of waves. Lanterns glow faintly in wooden harbours, and ships, simple yet full of possibility, rest against the tide, as if waiting for a dream to begin. Europe, in those distant centuries, was not yet a dominant force across the globe. It was a patchwork of kingdoms, languages, and quiet ambitions. Villages rested between forests and hills, and life moved to the rhythm of seasons. But somewhere within these lands, a gentle curiosity began to grow, a curiosity about what lay beyond the known. The oceans, vast and endlessly patient, stretched outward like a calm invitation. At first, these waters were seen as boundaries. The edges of maps faded into uncertainty, where imagination filled the unknown with soft wonder. Yet over time, those boundaries began to feel less like endings and more like beginnings. You can almost picture it now, the slow preparation. Craftsmen shaping wood into sturdy hulls, hands working carefully, deliberately. Sailors learning the language of the wind, watching how clouds moved across the sky, how stars guided the night. There was no rush, no sudden leap into the unknown, only a gradual unfolding, a quiet readiness. And with each passing year, the idea of journeying farther began to feel less like a distant dream and more like a natural step forward. The people of Europe were not driven by noise or urgency in this moment, but by something softer, a steady pull, a desire to understand the world beyond their familiar shores, to trace the edges of the earth, not with haste, but with patience. Ships began to leave the safety of harbours, gliding gently into open water. At first, they stayed close to land, following coastlines like a thread, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, they ventured farther. The horizon no longer felt like a wall, but like a doorway. And so, the story begins, not with conquest or command, but with quiet movement, with the soft creak of wood against water, with sails catching the wind like a slow, steady breath. Europe was beginning to reach outward, not all at once, and not with certainty, but with a calm persistence that would, over time, ripple across continents. As these early journeys unfolded, something subtle began to change. The oceans, once seen as vast separations, started to feel like connections. Invisible paths formed across the water, linking distant lands in ways that had never been imagined before. And in that gentle shift, the world itself began to grow smaller, more connected, more intertwined. Tonight, as you listen, let yourself drift along those early voyages. Feel the quiet rocking of the sea beneath you. Hear the soft wind moving through sails. There is no urgency here, no sharp edges, only the slow, steady unfolding of a story that would, in time, reshape the world. But for now, we remain at the beginning, where Europe stands at the edge of the ocean, looking outward and taking its first peaceful steps into a much wider world. As the oceans waited beyond the horizon, the lands of Europe themselves were slowly changing. Long before ships ventured far into open waters, something quieter was taking place inland, a gradual strengthening of kingdoms, like roots growing deeper beneath the soil. If you imagine Europe at this time, it is not yet a unified presence, but a gentle mosaic of realms. Small kingdoms, duchies, and city-states lie scattered across the landscape, each with its own rhythm, its own customs, its own quiet ambitions. Stone castles rise on hillsides, watching over winding rivers and fields that stretch into soft, distant horizons. Life moves steadily here. Markets open at dawn, filled with the low hum of voices and the scent of fresh bread. Bells ring from distant towers, marking the passing hours. And within these peaceful routines, something subtle is beginning to take shape. A sense of organization, of growing stability. Kings and queens, rulers of these lands, begin to gather more influence, not through sudden force, but through careful, deliberate steps. They form alliances, establish systems of governance, and slowly bring together scattered regions under shared banners. Roads improve, connecting villages and towns, allowing ideas and goods to travel more freely. There is a feeling of quiet preparation, as though Europe itself is slowly awakening to a wider possibility. In places like Portugal and Spain, along the western edges of the continent, this sense of readiness is especially strong. These lands, facing the vast Atlantic, begin to feel the pull of the ocean more deeply than others. Their coastlines become places of contemplation, where rulers and thinkers alike gaze out over the water and wonder what lies beyond. Further north, in England and France, kingdoms grow more structured, more stable. Systems of trade begin to flourish, weaving together communities across rivers and countryside. And as wealth gently increases, so too does the ability to imagine ventures beyond familiar borders. It is not a sudden transformation, but a slow unfolding. Like the turning of seasons, each change builds quietly upon the last. Knowledge begins to gather as well. Scholars study maps, though many are incomplete, filled with blank spaces and soft guesses. They observe the stars, charting their steady movements across the sky. There is a growing sense that the world, though vast, might be understood piece by piece, journey by journey. And within this growing understanding, the idea of exploration begins to feel less distant. Shipbuilding improves, almost unnoticed at first. Hulls become stronger, sails more responsive to the wind. Navigation techniques, passed down and refined, allow sailors to move with greater confidence across open waters. It is as if Europe is quietly learning how to breathe with the ocean. Yet even as these advancements take shape, there is no rush. The kingdoms of Europe are still grounded in their own lands, focused on balance and growth within. The outward expansion has not yet fully begun, but the foundation is being laid, gently and steadily. There is something almost peaceful in this stage of history, a sense that everything is aligning in its own time, that the fields, the roads, the towns, and the quiet harbours are all part of a larger story, one that has not yet revealed itself fully. And as night falls across these kingdoms, you can imagine the soft glow of firelight within stone walls, rulers speaking in hushed tones, considering possibilities, sailors dreaming of distant waters they have never seen, craftsmen shaping tools and vessels, unaware of how far their work will one day travel. Europe, in this moment, is like a traveller preparing for a long journey, gathering strength, knowledge, and quiet confidence. The oceans still wait. The distant lands remain unseen. But the first true steps toward expansion are forming, not in dramatic leaps, but in the calm, steady building of something new. And soon, Those early preparations will begin to carry Europe beyond its shores, into a world far wider than it has ever known. As the kingdoms of Europe settled into their growing strength, a gentle shift began along the coasts, a turning outward, guided not by urgency, but by a quiet sense of wonder. The sea, which had long been a boundary, now felt like an invitation. In the harbours of Portugal, where the land meets the Atlantic in soft, rugged curves, ships began to gather more frequently, not just for fishing or nearby trade, but for something more distant, more uncertain. The rulers of these coastal lands, especially, seemed to feel the pull of the horizon more deeply than others. There was a stillness to their decision-making, a careful patience. They did not rush into the unknown. Instead, they observed. They listened to the stories of sailors who had travelled slightly farther than most. They studied the winds, the currents, the rhythm of tides. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the first true voyages began. You can imagine those early journeys as quiet departures. The harbour at dawn, wrapped in pale light, ropes loosened, sails gently rising, the ship moving forward, not with force, but with a steady glide, carried by wind and intention. These were not grand expeditions at first. They stayed close to the coastline, following the familiar outline of land as it stretched southward along Africa. Each journey went just a little farther than the last. Each return brought back small pieces of knowledge, new currents, new stars, new ways of understanding the sea. It was a process of learning, of slowly becoming comfortable with distance. Prince Henry of Portugal, often remembered as a quiet supporter of exploration, played a gentle role in this unfolding. He did not sail himself, but he encouraged others to do so. He helped create spaces where knowledge could gather, where map-makers, sailors, and thinkers could share what they knew. There was no rush, no dramatic leap, only a steady accumulation of understanding. Ships improved in subtle ways. The caravel, light and maneuverable, became a companion to these early explorers. Its sails could catch shifting winds more easily, allowing sailors to move with the ocean rather than against it. And as these ships ventured farther, something began to change in the minds of those on board. The coastline, once a constant guide, slowly disappeared from view. There is a quiet moment you can imagine, when land fades into the distance and all that remains is water and sky. No markers, no boundaries, just the gentle rise and fall of waves beneath the ship, and the endless horizon ahead. For many, this must have felt both peaceful and profound. The stars became companions in the night, guiding direction with their steady light. The sun marked the passage of time during the day. The wind whispered its patterns, sometimes soft, sometimes shifting, always present. And with each voyage, confidence grew. Soon, these journeys extended beyond simple coastal exploration. Ships began to round the western edge of Africa, discovering new lands, not as sudden surprises, but as quiet arrivals. Each place brought new sights, new cultures, new possibilities for connection. The idea of the world began to expand, not in a single moment, but like a slowly opening map. At the same time, in Spain, a similar curiosity began to stir. The kingdoms there, newly unified, turned their gaze westward. While Portugal followed the African coastline, Spain wondered about the vast ocean beyond, the Atlantic, stretching into what seemed like endless blue. It was a different direction, but guided by the same calm curiosity. And so, Europe stood at the threshold of something new. The early voyages had shown that the sea could be navigated. That distance could be crossed, that the unknown was not unreachable. There was still uncertainty, of course, but it no longer felt overwhelming. It felt inviting. As you drift with this story, imagine those ships once more, moving gently across open water, the creak of wood, the soft pull of sails, the quiet focus of sailors as they look out toward a horizon that no longer feels distant but possible. This was the beginning of exploration, not as a sudden burst, but as a slow and steady unfolding. And with each passing journey, Europe moved a little farther from its familiar shores and a little closer to becoming connected with the wider world. As the voyages grew longer and the confidence of sailors deepened, the oceans themselves began to feel less like vast separations and more like quiet pathways, gently linking distant parts of the world. There is something calming about this transformation. The idea that the same waters touching Europe's shores also reached faraway lands, unseen but present, like a soft thread connecting continents. In the late 15th century, one of these journeys moved not along a coastline, but outward into the open Atlantic. It was a different kind of voyage, one that trusted not the sight of land, but the patterns of wind and the steady guidance of the stars. You can imagine the stillness of that moment, a ship surrounded by endless blue, the horizon stretching in every direction, unchanged and constant, days passing in a gentle rhythm, the creak of wood, the quiet conversations among sailors, the soft glow of sunrise and sunset blending into one another. And then, slowly, land, not discovered in a sudden rush, but appearing like a quiet answer to a long-held question. These new lands, across the Atlantic, were not empty or waiting, but from the perspective of European travelers, they felt like an expansion of the known world. Islands first, then larger stretches of land, each one adding to the growing sense that the world was far wider than maps had once suggested. At the same time, along the southern edge of Africa, another path was being traced. Portuguese sailors moving steadily down the coastline eventually rounded its tip, the place where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans meet in a calm yet powerful exchange. This was not a dramatic turning point, but a gentle opening. Beyond that southern tip lay new waters, new routes, and a connection to lands further east. The idea that one could sail from Europe to Asia by sea began to feel not just possible, but real. And so, the oceans began to weave together continents that had long existed separately in the minds of European travelers. There is a quiet beauty in this moment of history, not because of sudden change, but because of gradual connection. The world, once imagined as distant and fragmented, began to feel more whole. Ships carried not only goods, but stories. They brought back impressions of unfamiliar coastlines, new plants, different skies. Each return voyage added another layer to Europe's understanding of the wider world. Maps began to change. Where there had once been blank spaces, there were now outlines, soft, tentative shapes at first, then more detailed with each passing journey. Cartographers worked slowly, carefully, translating the experiences of sailors into lines and curves on parchment. And as these maps expanded, so too did the imagination of those who studied them. The oceans no longer seemed like barriers. They became bridges. Across these bridges, connections began to form, not all at once, and not evenly, but gradually. A quiet exchange of goods, ideas, and presence began to take shape. Europe, once focused inward, was now gently extending itself outward, touching distant shores, becoming aware of a world much larger than it had known. There was still uncertainty, of course. The journeys were long, the distances vast, but the fear of the unknown had softened. In its place was a calm sense of possibility. As you continue to drift through this story, imagine those early maps unfolding slowly on wooden tables, fingers tracing coastlines that had only recently been seen, conversations held in hushed tones, filled with curiosity rather than certainty. The world was no longer a mystery at its edges. It was becoming a landscape of connection, and Europe, carried by wind and water, was finding its place within it. Not all at once, but step by step, voyage by voyage. The oceans had opened, and beyond them, a new chapter was quietly beginning to form. As the oceans grew more familiar and the routes across them became gently understood, a new phase began to unfold, one that moved beyond discovery and into quiet presence. The voyages no longer ended simply with arrival and return. Instead, in certain distant lands, small European communities began to take shape. Soft footholds along foreign shores formed slowly and without haste. These early colonies were not yet vast or dominant. They were modest, often fragile, and deeply connected to the rhythm of the places in which they appeared. Wooden structures rose near coastlines, simple shelters first, then more permanent buildings as time passed. Gardens were planted, paths were worn into the earth, and the sound of daily life began to settle into these new spaces. You can imagine the stillness of those early mornings, the unfamiliar light of dawn falling across new landscapes, the gentle blending of old habits with new surroundings, the quiet work of building, growing, and adapting. In the Americas, along stretches of coastline and river, European settlers began to establish these small communities. They arrived not in overwhelming numbers, but in steady waves, each group adding to what had already begun. The land, vast and varied, offered both challenge and possibility, and life there unfolded slowly, shaped by both distance and connection. Further south, Spanish and Portuguese presence began to grow in a similar, gradual way. Their settlements expanded gently over time, guided by the same quiet persistence that had marked the earlier voyages. Harbours formed points of connection between continents, where ships could arrive, rest, and return again. Across the oceans in parts of Africa and Asia, European traders and travellers also began to create small outposts. These were often places of exchange, spaces where goods, ideas, and cultures met in a calm and continuous flow. They were not isolated from the world around them, but woven into it, becoming part of a larger shared landscape. There is a softness to this stage of history, a sense that the expansion of Europe was not a sudden wave, but a slow tide moving steadily across time. Each settlement, each outpost was like a small ripple, subtle on its own, but part of a much larger pattern. Trade began to anchor these early colonies. Ships travelled back and forth across the oceans, carrying goods that linked distant regions together. Spices, textiles, metals, and crops moved along these routes, not in hurried exchanges, but in steady, rhythmic cycles. The sea became a pathway of continuity, connecting lives across vast distances. And with this movement came a quiet blending of worlds. Languages mixed gently in marketplaces. New foods were introduced and gradually became familiar. Ways of life adapted, not abruptly, but through daily experience. The boundaries between places softened, and a sense of global connection began to take root. Yet, even as these colonies grew, they remained closely tied to Europe. They were extensions, reflections of distant homelands, shaped by the cultures and traditions carried across the sea. Letters traveled slowly between continents, carrying news, thoughts, and the quiet reassurance of connection. Time moved differently in these places. Seasons felt unfamiliar at first, then slowly became part of life's rhythm. The distance from Europe created a sense of stillness, as though these colonies existed in a gentle pause between worlds, neither entirely new nor entirely old. As you imagine this phase, let yourself drift through one of these early settlements. Hear the soft murmur of voices, the distant call of the sea, the quiet work of hands shaping a life in a new land. There is no urgency here, only a steady unfolding. Europe's reach was extending, not through sudden force, but through presence, through small beginnings that would, over time, grow into something far larger. The seeds of connection had been planted. And as they took root across continents, the story of expansion continued, moving gently forward, carried by the same calm persistence that had guided it from the very beginning. As these early settlements took root and the quiet rhythm of connection deepened, Europe's presence across the world began to expand in a more noticeable, yet still unhurried way. What had once been scattered outposts and small coastal communities slowly grew into wider networks, threads of influence stretching across oceans, linking distant shores with a steady, almost seamless continuity. There was no single moment when this change occurred. Instead, it unfolded gradually, like the slow widening of a river as it moves toward the sea. In the Americas, European settlements expanded inland, following rivers that curved gently through forests and plains. These waterways became natural guides, carrying not only boats, but also the idea of connection deeper into the land. Small towns grew into larger communities, and paths between them became roads, worn smooth by time and travel. To the south, Spanish and Portuguese influence spread across vast landscapes, shaping regions that would carry traces of their language and culture for centuries to come. Cities emerged slowly, their foundations laid with care, their streets forming patterns that echoed distant European towns while adapting to entirely new environments. Across the Atlantic, along the coasts of Africa, European presence remained more focused on trade and exchange. Ports became places of quiet activity, where ships arrived and departed in a steady rhythm. These were meeting points, spaces where the movement of goods and ideas created a gentle flow between continents. Further east, in parts of Asia, European traders established footholds that would gradually grow in importance. These places were not isolated expansions, but part of a wider network, each one connected by the same oceans that had first carried explorers outward. There is something almost meditative in imagining these connections forming, ships moving steadily along established routes, sails rising and falling with the wind, the same journey repeated again and again until it became familiar, almost routine. What was once unknown had become part of a larger pattern, woven into the fabric of daily life. And as these routes became more reliable, European empires began to take shape, not as sudden constructions, but as natural extensions of what had already begun. England, France, Spain, Portugal, and others each developed their own networks of influence, guided by geography, opportunity, and the quiet persistence of time. Their presence across the world was not identical, but each contributed to the growing sense that Europe was no longer contained within its own borders. The oceans, once vast and uncertain, had become pathways of connection. Trade continued to anchor this expansion. Goods moved along these routes with increasing regularity, linking economies across continents. Crops grown in one part of the world appeared in markets far away. Materials traveled across oceans, shaping industries and daily life in places separated by thousands of miles. With this movement came a deeper sense of global awareness. People in Europe began to think not only of their own lands, but of distant places connected through trade and travel. The world, once imagined in fragments, now felt more unified, its parts linked by the steady flow of ships and the quiet exchange of goods and ideas. And yet, even as this expansion grew, the pace remained gentle. There were no sudden leaps, no overwhelming changes in a single moment. Instead, there was continuity, a calm unfolding that allowed each new development to settle into place before the next began. As you drift through this part of the story, imagine standing on a quiet shoreline once more. The sea stretches out before you, its surface smooth and endless. In the distance, a ship moves slowly across the horizon, following a route that has been traveled many times before. It carries with it not just goods, but connection, not just movement, but the quiet continuation of a story that has been unfolding for generations. Europe's reach had grown wider now, its presence felt across continents. But still, it moved like the tide, steady, patient, and ever-expanding, shaping the world in ways that would only fully reveal themselves with time. As Europe's presence extended across continents, the connections between distant lands began to settle into a gentle rhythm, one defined not by sudden movement, but by repetition, familiarity, and flow. The oceans, once filled with uncertainty, had become pathways that were quietly understood. Ships now followed routes that felt almost like memory, curving across the Atlantic, circling around Africa, stretching toward Asia. These routes were not drawn in haste, but shaped over time, refined by countless journeys, each one adding a little more certainty to the next. If you imagine the world from above during this time, it might appear as a web of soft, invisible lines across the sea, lines that connected Europe to the Americas, to Africa, to Asia. Not sharply, but gently, like threads woven into a vast and intricate fabric. Trade became the steady heartbeat of this growing network. Ships carried goods across these routes in a continuous, almost meditative cycle. From the Americas came crops that would slowly become familiar in Europe, plants that carried the warmth of distant soils. From Asia came finely crafted textiles and delicate goods, each one reflecting traditions shaped over centuries. From Africa came resources and connection that tied into this expanding system. Nothing moved all at once. Instead, it was a quiet, ongoing exchange. Like the rise and fall of the tide, ports grew into places of calm activity. Harbors that had once been small and quiet now welcomed ships from distant lands. You can almost hear the gentle sounds, the creak of ropes, the soft murmur of voices speaking in different languages, the distant call of seabirds circling above. There is no urgency here, only rhythm. Goods are unloaded, sorted, and carried into markets. New items appear alongside familiar ones, gradually becoming part of daily life. Spices, fabrics, metals, and tools all find their place within this growing network, moving slowly but steadily from one part of the world to another. And with these goods come ideas. Stories travel just as quietly as cargo. Sailors share what they have seen, distant coastlines, unfamiliar customs, skies that look slightly different from those at home. These stories, passed from one person to another, begin to shape how people imagine the world. Europe, once focused inward, now sees itself as part of something much larger. In cities across the continent, this growing connection becomes more visible. Markets expand, streets become more lively. The presence of distant lands can be felt not through sudden change, but through subtle additions. A new flavor, a different fabric, a quiet awareness that the world extends far beyond the horizon. At the same time, the structure of these connections becomes more organized. Trading companies begin to form, not as hurried ventures, but as steady systems designed to maintain and support these long-distance exchanges. They coordinate voyages, manage goods, and ensure that the rhythm of trade continues without disruption. These organizations act like quiet custodians of the network, helping to keep everything flowing smoothly. And so, the web of connection grows stronger. Routes that were once uncertain become reliable. Journeys that were once rare become expected. The distance between continents, though still vast, begins to feel less isolating. There is a sense of calm continuity in this stage of history. The world is not changing in sudden bursts, but in gentle layers. Each voyage, each exchange, each small moment of connection adds to a larger pattern, one that binds continents together through the steady movement of people, goods, and ideas. As you drift deeper into this story, imagine yourself aboard one of these ships. The sea stretches endlessly around you, calm and steady. The journey is long, but it is known. The path ahead has been traveled before and will be traveled again. There is comfort in that familiarity. Europe's influence now flows along these routes, not as a forceful wave, but as a quiet current, moving steadily across the world. And with each passing year, this network of connection becomes more complete, shaping a world that feels increasingly linked, increasingly shared, and gently united by the oceans that once kept it apart. As these networks of connection deepened and the rhythms of trade became familiar, Europe found itself at a moment of quiet prominence, a time when its influence seemed to stretch gently across much of the known world. There was no single day when this shift became clear. Instead, it revealed itself gradually, like the slow brightening of morning light. Ports were busier, maps more complete, and the presence of European languages, customs, and systems could be felt across distant continents. From the calm harbours of London and Lisbon to the sunlit shores of the Caribbean, from the trading posts of West Africa to the coastal cities of India and Southeast Asia, there existed a shared sense of connection, woven together through years of steady expansion. Europe, once one region among many, now stood at the center of a vast and gently interconnected world. Ships moved continuously along well-known routes, their journeys forming a kind of quiet pulse that linked continents together. These vessels carried more than goods. They carried patterns, expectations, and a sense of continuity. Wherever they arrived, they brought with them familiar ways of organizing trade, building settlements, and structuring daily life. This was not a loud dominance, but a subtle presence, something that settled into place over time. Cities across Europe reflected this growing influence. Streets became more active, filled with goods from distant lands. Coffee, tea, and other new comforts entered daily routines, not as sudden novelties, but as gradual additions that became part of life's gentle rhythm. In distant regions, European-built towns and administrative centres began to mirror aspects of their origins. Architecture, language, and customs carried across oceans took root in new environments, blending softly with local traditions. There is a calm complexity in this moment. It is not a world overtaken, but a world increasingly connected through European pathways. Systems of governance, trade, and communication began to align in ways that made long-distance interaction feel more natural, more expected. Time itself seemed to move differently across this network. Messages traveled slowly but steadily, carried by ships that crossed oceans with quiet determination. Decisions made in Europe would ripple outward, reaching distant colonies after long journeys, and in return, news from faraway places would make its way back, adding to the growing awareness of a shared global space. There is something almost meditative in imagining this exchange. A letter written in a quiet European study, sealed and carried aboard a ship, weeks passing as it moves across the sea. Then, finally, its arrival in a distant land, where it is opened and read under a different sky. These small moments, repeated countless times, helped create a sense of unity across distance. Empires, by this stage, had taken clearer shape. The British, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Dutch each maintained their own networks of influence, stretching across oceans and continents. These were not static structures, but living systems, constantly shifting, growing, and adapting to the flow of trade and the passage of time. Yet, even at this peak, there was a softness to the expansion. It was not a single force moving outward, but many threads intertwining. Each empire followed its own path, but together they contributed to a broader pattern, one in which Europe played a central role in connecting the world. As you rest within this part of the story, imagine standing on a high cliff overlooking the sea. Below, ships move slowly across the water, their paths crossing and diverging in quiet harmony. The horizon is wide, and beyond it lie countless places, all gently linked through these journeys. The world, once distant and divided, now feels closer, more connected, quietly unified through the steady presence of Europe. And yet, even in this moment of calm prominence, change continues to gather, subtle at first, like a distant shift in the wind, because soon a new kind of transformation will begin, not across the oceans, but within Europe itself, one that will deepen its influence in ways both quiet and profound. As Europe's connections stretched across the world and its presence settled into distant lands, another transformation began to unfold, one that did not start on the ocean, but within the quiet towns and cities of Europe itself. It began softly, almost unnoticed at first, in workshops and along riverbanks, in small buildings filled with the steady rhythm of hands at work. New methods of making and creating started to appear. What had once been crafted slowly, piece by piece, began to change, not abruptly, but through a gradual shift toward greater consistency and flow. The air in these places carried a different kind of energy, not hurried, but purposeful. The turning of wheels, the movement of simple machines, the steady coordination of labor all created a quiet hum, like a new rhythm settling into daily life. This was the beginning of what would later be known as the Industrial Revolution. But in this moment, It did not feel like a revolution. It felt like an evolution, a gentle unfolding of new possibilities. In England especially, this change became more visible. Small innovations in how goods were produced began to gather momentum. Water wheels turned with steady force, powering simple machinery. Later, the soft introduction of steam power added another layer, allowing movement and production to continue beyond the limits of wind and water. There is something calming in imagining these early machines, not loud or overwhelming, but steady and rhythmic, turning, lifting, shaping materials with a quiet persistence. And as these methods improved, something subtle began to shift in Europe's role within the wider world. Goods could now be produced more efficiently, in greater quantities, and with more consistency. Textiles, tools, and other items began to flow outward from Europe, along the same trade routes that had already been established. Ships that once carried primarily raw materials and distant goods now also carried finished products, shaped by these new processes. The balance of exchange began to change. Europe was no longer only connected to the world through exploration and trade. It was beginning to shape that connection through production and innovation. Cities slowly adapted to this new rhythm. Buildings grew larger, designed to hold machinery and workers together in shared spaces. Streets became more active, not with urgency, but with steady movement. People traveled from countryside to town, drawn by the opportunity to be part of this evolving way of life. And yet, even with these changes, there remained a sense of continuity. The same rivers flowed through these cities. The same skies stretched overhead. The changes were layered gently upon what had come before, not replacing it entirely, but reshaping it over time. Across the world, the effects of this transformation began to ripple outward. Colonies and distant regions, already connected through trade, became part of this new system in a deeper way. Raw materials traveled to Europe, where they were shaped and transformed, then sent outward again as finished goods. The cycle continued, steady and continuous, like the turning of the machines themselves. There is a quiet symmetry in this process. The oceans carried materials inward and outward. The land supported production. And Europe, at the center of this network, became a place where these movements converged and expanded. As you drift through this part of the story, imagine standing inside one of these early workshops. The light filters softly through high windows. The air is warm, filled with the gentle rhythm of machinery. There is no rush, only a steady, continuous motion, like a calm heartbeat. This new rhythm begins to blend with the older rhythms of trade and exploration. Together, they create something more complex, yet still balanced. A world where connection is not only about distance, but also about transformation, where materials, ideas, and efforts move through cycles that link continents together. Europe's influence deepens here, not through sudden expansion, but through the quiet power of creation and movement. And as this new way of life settles into place, it prepares the world for another shift, one that will shape societies, economies, and connections in ways that are both subtle and far-reaching. The story continues, as it always has, slowly, steadily, carried forward by the gentle currents of change. As the quiet rhythm of industry settled into Europe's cities and towns, its influence began to take on a new shape, one that reached beyond ships and trade, and into the very structure of how societies were organized. It was not a sudden transformation, but a gradual alignment. Across continents, the systems that had first traveled outward with explorers and settlers began to deepen. Ways of organizing cities, governing communities, and managing trade slowly took root in distant lands, blending with local traditions in calm and complex ways. There is something almost gentle in how this spread occurred. In growing towns across the Americas, in ports along African coasts, and in regions of Asia touched by European presence, familiar patterns began to appear. Streets arranged in ordered lines, administrative centers placed carefully within cities, and systems of law and communication introduced in steady, deliberate steps. These were not identical copies of Europe, but reflections adapted to different landscapes, climates, and cultures. The world in this period began to share certain structures. Time was measured more uniformly. Trade was conducted with shared expectations. Written records, systems of governance, and methods of organization created a sense of continuity across distance. If you imagine moving from one continent to another during this era, there would be differences, of course, new languages, new environments, new ways of life. But there would also be a quiet familiarity, small details that echoed something known, a style of building, a way of conducting business, a shared sense of order. This did not replace what already existed, but layered gently upon it, and through this layering, the world became more interconnected, not only through movement, but through structure. Education, too, began to follow these patterns. In certain regions, schools and centers of learning reflected European traditions, introducing new ways of studying, recording, and sharing knowledge. Books traveled along the same routes as goods, carrying ideas across oceans in a steady, unhurried flow. There is a calm continuity in this exchange. A thought formed in one place could slowly make its way to another, carried across time and distance. Knowledge, like trade, became part of the network, moving quietly, shaping minds and perspectives in subtle ways. Meanwhile, the Industrial Revolution continued to deepen its influence. Railways began to appear, stretching across landscapes like gentle lines of connection. Steamships moved along rivers and across oceans with steady reliability. Communication improved, not in sudden leaps, but in gradual steps that made the world feel smaller and more reachable. Distance, once vast and isolating, began to feel softer. Journeys that once took months became shorter. Messages traveled with greater certainty. The pace of connection increased, yet it remained steady, never rushed, always unfolding in its own time. Europe, at the center of these developments, became a kind of quiet organizer within the global network. Its influence was no longer only about reaching outward, but about shaping how those connections functioned. Systems, structures, and rhythms of life began to align across continents, creating a shared framework that linked distant places together. And yet, even within this alignment, there remained diversity. Each region adapted these influences in its own way, blending them with local traditions and histories. The result was not uniformity, but a complex and layered world, connected, yet varied, shared, yet distinct. As you rest within this part of the journey, imagine a map once more. But now, instead of blank spaces, it is filled with pathways, cities, and connections. Not sharp or overwhelming, but softly detailed, like a tapestry woven over time. The oceans still carry ships. The land supports growing communities. And between them, Invisible threads of structure and understanding hold everything together. This is a world shaped not only by movement, but by quiet organization. A world where Europe's influence has settled deeply into the patterns of life itself, guiding, connecting, and gently shaping the way distant places relate to one another. And as this structure reaches its fullest expression, another subtle shift begins to form, one that will slowly challenge this balance and guide the world toward a new arrangement. As the world settled into these shared patterns of connection and structure, a quiet shift began to emerge, not sudden, not disruptive, but subtle, like a change in the direction of a gentle breeze. For a long time, Europe's influence had flowed outward steadily, shaping distant lands through trade, industry, and organization. But now, in different parts of the world, new centers of thought and growth began to form, softly at first, almost unnoticed. In the Americas, societies that had grown under European systems began to develop their own sense of identity. Cities that once looked entirely toward Europe started to feel more grounded in their own landscapes. The distance across the ocean, though still bridged by ships, began to feel more significant in a quiet, reflective way. There was no sharp break, only a gradual turning inward. Communities adapted what they had inherited, shaping it into something that felt more their own. Local voices grew clearer, more confident, not in opposition, but in quiet independence. The familiar structures remained, but they were no longer only reflections. They became foundations for something new. Across other parts of the world, similar patterns unfolded. In regions of Asia and Africa, long-standing cultures and traditions continued to exist alongside European systems, sometimes blending, sometimes remaining distinct. Over time, these regions began to reassert their own rhythms more clearly, drawing from deep histories that had always been present beneath the surface. There is a calm resilience in this moment, not a dramatic shift, but a steady rebalancing, a reminder that the world, though connected, is made up of many centers, each with its own quiet strength. Meanwhile, within Europe itself, the pace of change continued. Industry grew more advanced, cities more active, and connections more refined. But with this growth came new questions. Soft reflections about balance, about the nature of progress, about how these vast networks should be maintained. The systems that had once expanded outward so smoothly now required more care to sustain. Trade routes remained active, but they were no longer the only source of influence. Ideas began to flow more freely in all directions. Knowledge that had once traveled outward from Europe now returned enriched by experiences from across the world. This exchange created a more balanced flow, less one-directional, more shared. There is something deeply calming in this shift. The world was no longer centered in a single place, but gently redistributing its energy across many regions. Europe remained important, still deeply connected, but no longer the only guiding force. As you imagine this time, picture the same oceans that once carried explorers outward. Now they carry journeys in many directions. Ships still move steadily across the water, but their purpose feels more varied, more shared. The horizon, once a symbol of expansion, now feels like a meeting point. And within this quiet rebalancing, a new understanding begins to form. That influence, like the tide, can rise and fall. That connection is not owned by any one place, but created through the movement of many. That the world, though shaped by Europe's long period of expansion, is beginning to find a broader harmony. There is no urgency in this change, only a slow unfolding, a gentle shift towards something more evenly distributed, more interconnected in a different way. And as this balance continues to evolve, the next stage of the journey approaches, where Europe's once wide reach begins to soften, and the world gradually moves toward a new arrangement of influence. As the balance of the world continued to shift in quiet, measured ways, Europe's once far-reaching influence began to soften, not disappearing, but gently redistributing itself across a wider, more shared global landscape. There was no single moment that marked this change. Instead, it unfolded slowly, like the fading of twilight into night. The systems, connections, and structures that Europe had helped shape remained in place, but their center of gravity began to move. What had once been guided mostly from distant capitals now began to take on lives of their own in the regions where they had settled. In the Americas, nations that had grown from European beginnings stood more firmly on their own foundations. Their cities continued to thrive, their systems continued to function, but their direction increasingly came from within rather than across the ocean. The long-distance ties remained, but they felt different now, less like guidance, more like connection. Across Africa and Asia, a similar soft transition could be felt. European presence, once central in many areas, became just one part of a much broader and more complex picture. Local traditions, long histories, and deep cultural roots continued to shape these regions, rising more visibly within the global flow. There is a quiet dignity in this moment, a sense that the world is gently returning to a more balanced state, where many voices contribute to the overall rhythm. Europe remains an important thread, but no longer the only one guiding the weave. Meanwhile, within Europe itself, the changes of industry and progress continued to evolve. Cities remained active, connected by railways and communication systems that had grown steadily over time. The same innovations that had once strengthened Europe's outward reach now connected it more deeply within itself and with the rest of the world in new ways. The direction of influence was no longer outward alone. It moved in all directions, like a calm, circulating current. Trade still flowed across oceans, but it had become more balanced. Goods, ideas, and knowledge traveled back and forth in a steady exchange, reflecting a world that had grown more interconnected and more equal in its movement. There is something peaceful in imagining this transition. The same ships still cross the sea, but they no longer carry the weight of expansion. Instead, they move as part of a shared global rhythm, linking places that now stand more independently, yet remain connected through history and exchange. The structures built during Europe's era of expansion continue to exist, but they are no longer defined by a single center. They have become part of a larger system, shaped by many hands, many cultures, many perspectives. As you drift through this part of the story, imagine the map once more, where Europe's lines of connection once stretched outward like spokes from a single hub. They now form a more balanced web, interconnected in all directions, without a single dominant center. The world feels wider again, yet more unified. Europe's long period of expansion has left its mark, visible in languages, cities, systems, and shared patterns of life. But now, those elements exist within a broader harmony, no longer held tightly in one place. There is no sense of loss here. only transformation. A quiet understanding that influence changes over time, that balance shifts, and that the world continues to evolve in gentle, steady ways. And as this stage settles into calm continuity, the story moves toward its final reflection, where all these centuries of movement, connection, and change come together in a peaceful understanding of the world we know today. And now, as the long journey of this story begins to settle, we find ourselves drifting gently above the centuries, looking back at the quiet unfolding of a time when Europe reached beyond its shores and for a while held a wide and steady influence across the world. It did not happen all at once. It began with small steps, wooden ships resting in quiet harbors, sails lifting slowly into the wind, and minds filled not with certainty, but with curiosity. From those early moments a path was formed, not straight or sudden, but winding, patient and persistent. Across oceans, Europe extended itself, first through exploration, tracing coastlines and crossing open waters, then through settlement, planting small communities that grew slowly over time, then through trade, weaving distant lands together with steady, rhythmic exchange, and later through industry, shaping not just movement, but the very way goods and ideas flowed across the world, each stage built upon the last, like layers of a calm and continuous tide. There is something deeply peaceful in seeing it this way, not as a story of sudden change, but as a long and gentle process, a gradual expansion that connected continents, reshaped maps, and brought distant places into quiet relationship with one another. For a time, Europe stood at the center of this network. Its ships moved across familiar routes. Its systems helped organize distant lands. Its ideas traveled along the same pathways as goods and stories. The world, in many ways, began to share certain patterns, subtle echoes of European influence woven into the fabric of daily life across continents. And yet, as we have seen, this was never a fixed state. Like the ocean itself, influence moves. What rises gently will, in time, settle and shift. And so, the world continued to change. The connections that Europe helped create remained, but they became shared, carried forward by many regions, many voices, many perspectives. The center softened, the web widened, and what was once directed outward from one place became a more balanced and flowing exchange across all parts of the world. Today, if you look closely, you can still see the traces of that long era, in the languages spoken across continents, in the shapes of cities, in the patterns of trade and communication, in the quiet familiarity that exists between distant places. These are not signs of dominance, but of connection, a reminder that the past, though distant, continues to echo softly through the present. As you rest here at the end of this journey, imagine once more the ocean at night. The surface is calm, reflecting the faint light of stars above. Somewhere in the distance, a ship moves slowly across the horizon, not in haste, not in uncertainty, but in quiet continuity. The same waters that once carried explorers now carry countless journeys in all directions. The same winds still guide movement across the sea, and the world, shaped by centuries of gentle expansion and connection, continues to turn in its steady, unhurried way. Europe's story, in this context, is not one of beginning or end, but of passage, a long flowing chapter in the greater story of a connected world. And now, as the waves settle and the horizon fades into soft darkness, you can let go of the details, the places, the time. Allow the calm rhythm of this journey to carry you into rest. The ships grow distant, the voices fade, and the ocean remains quiet, endless, and at peace.